You built an empire because one forgotten mechanic kept your engines alive. The day you stopped listening to him was the day your company began to die. Nobody inside Hayes Power Systems understood why their legendary CEO, Victoria Hayes, abandoned a board meeting halfway through the worst financial crisis in the company's history. The trading screens were glowing red. Investors were demanding answers. Television anchors were already calling it one of the fastest corporate collapses in modern manufacturing. Yet instead of driving toward another emergency meeting, Victoria turned her black SUV onto an old Tulane County road that disappeared beneath towering maple trees outside the city. 20 minutes later, she stopped in front of a weathered garage with faded blue paint and a wooden sign that simply read Walker Auto and Engine Repair. The building looked exactly as it had a decade earlier. The same gravel parking lot, the same rusty mailbox, the same wind chime hanging beside the office door, softly ringing in the afternoon breeze. Time had rushed past the rest of the world, but somehow it had chosen to walk slowly here. Inside, Ethan Walker tightened the final bolt on an aging V8 engine resting on a steel workbench. His hands were stained with grease, his denim shirt rolled to his elbows, his reading glasses resting low on his nose. The radio quietly played an old country song, while sunlight slipped through dusty windows, turning floating particles into tiny streams of gold. Nothing about him suggested urgency. Nothing about him suggested he had heard the news shaking Wall Street. His 10-year-old daughter, Lily, sat nearby finishing her homework at a small wooden desk tucked into the corner of the shop. Every few minutes she glanced toward her father, smiling whenever he looked up. She had grown up surrounded by engines, wrenches, and the steady rhythm of honest work. To her, this little garage was the safest place in the world. The front bell chimed softly as the office door opened. Victoria stepped inside wearing a tailored navy suit that had once represented confidence and authority. Today it looked heavy, almost unfamiliar. Her eyes paused on Ethan, but he didn't immediately notice her. He simply finished tightening the bolt, wiped his hands with an old cotton towel, and carefully covered the engine before turning around. Their eyes met for the first time in nearly a year. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the autumn wind brushed across the trees while somewhere in the distance a freight train echoed through the valley. The silence between them carried the weight of 10 years. Finally, Victoria took one slow step forward. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. He studied her face without anger, without satisfaction, only with the calm expression of a man who had learned long ago that pride could never repair what truth eventually revealed. He looked past her through the open garage door toward the empty highway, then back into her tired eyes. "What happened?" he asked gently. Victoria lowered her head for the first time in her career. "Everything fell apart after I stopped bringing my engines to you." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for an old metal kettle resting on a hot plate near the back wall and quietly poured 2 cups of fresh coffee. The rich aroma drifted through the garage, blending with the familiar scent of machine oil, clean steel, and seasoned wood that had filled this place for longer than Lily could remember. He slid 1 cup across the worn wooden table toward Victoria, who stared at it as though kindness had become something she no longer deserved. Lily looked between them without saying a word. She had never met the elegant woman standing inside the garage, but she had seen her photograph more than once in old business magazines left behind by customers. Ethan gave his daughter a gentle smile. "Would you mind finishing your homework in the office for a little while?" Lily nodded, gathered her notebook, and quietly disappeared behind the small frosted glass door, leaving the 2 adults alone with 10 years of unspoken history. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, but never took a sip. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. Ethan noticed, yet he said nothing. He had learned years ago that silence often invited honesty more gently than questions ever could. Finally, Victoria exhaled. "Do you remember the first engine I brought here?" she asked softly. Ethan looked toward the shelves lining the far wall. Hundreds of carefully labeled wooden crates rested there, each one containing parts, notes, sketches, or measurements from projects completed over many years. "It was late October," he answered without hesitation. "You drove a silver pickup because your company was still renting equipment back then. The prototype overheated after 37 minutes. The crankshaft bearings were wearing unevenly." Victoria slowly looked up, stunned by the precision of his memory. Ethan offered only a small smile. That engine paid for Lily's first winter coat after her mother passed away. The words settled gently into the quiet room. Victoria lowered her eyes. She had never known that detail. 10 years earlier, she had been an ambitious executive determined to build a manufacturing company that could compete with the largest names in the country. She remembered arriving at the little garage frustrated after every engineer on her payroll had failed to solve a recurring problem. Someone in a neighboring town had quietly recommended a mechanic who understood engines better than most people understood people. She had expected an elderly machinist. Instead, she found a widowed father holding a toddler on one arm while tightening cylinder bolts with the other. She remembered doubting him almost immediately. His shop was too small. His equipment looked too old. His clothes carried permanent stains from years of honest work. Yet 48 hours later, the engine returned running smoother than it ever had before. She paid the invoice, thanked him politely, and drove away believing she had simply found an unusually talented mechanic. She never asked how he solved problems that entire engineering teams could not explain. She never wondered why every prototype performed better after leaving this garage than it had inside her own research laboratory. Year after year, she kept returning with another damaged engine, another impossible deadline, another promise that someone from headquarters would follow up. Nobody ever did. Ethan never complained. He simply repaired what arrived at his door, packed every engine with extraordinary care, and watched another truck disappear down the highway while the little girl inside the office grew 1 year older with every passing season. Victoria slowly traced one finger around the rim of her coffee cup, while memories she had buried beneath quarterly reports and shareholder meetings quietly returned. At first, she had visited only once every few months, but as Hayes Power Systems expanded, the deliveries became more frequent. A transport truck would arrive carrying another prototype that refused to perform inside the laboratory. Sometimes the engine suffered from overheating. Sometimes it vibrated under heavy loads. Sometimes it simply refused to produce the efficiency her engineers promised investors. The pattern never changed. The damaged engine would disappear behind Ethan's garage doors for a few days, and when it returned, it would run with a smooth confidence that no one at headquarters could fully explain. Victoria accepted the results because success always seemed more important than understanding. Ethan never celebrated when another engine left his shop. He would carefully wipe every fingerprint from the polished metal, secure every bolt one final time, and include a small handwritten inspection sheet inside the shipping crate. Most companies would have framed those notes as technical reports. Ethan simply considered them part of doing honest work. At corporate headquarters, however, those pages rarely survived the journey. Administrative assistants often tossed them into recycling bins before the crates even reached the engineering department. Nobody imagined that the mechanic's observations could be worth reading. Ethan never knew that his notes disappeared almost every time. He kept writing them anyway because he believed the next technician deserved every piece of information he could provide. Seasons passed with quiet consistency. Spring rain tapped against the garage roof while engines rested on steel stands waiting for careful hands. Summer sunlight poured through the open bay doors as Lily handed her father cleaned shop towels after school. Autumn leaves drifted across the gravel parking lot, while another truck from Hayes Power Systems rolled in before sunrise. During winter, snow covered the surrounding fields. Yet Ethan still arrived before dawn to warm the shop, so cold metal would not crack under sudden temperature changes. Every repaired engine carried a little more than mechanical precision. It carried patience, discipline, and respect for people Ethan would probably never meet. Meanwhile, Victoria's company grew faster every year. New manufacturing plants opened across several states. Business magazines praised her leadership. Financial networks celebrated her bold vision. Industry awards lined the walls of her executive office. Investors applauded every quarterly announcement. The board congratulated the engineering division for remarkable breakthroughs in reliability and performance. Ethan's name was never mentioned because no one thought to ask where those remarkable improvements truly began. On one quiet evening nearly 6 years earlier, Lily had watched another Hayes truck disappear beyond the hills before asking a simple question. "Daddy, why do they always look so serious when they bring the engines here, but so happy when they leave?" Ethan smiled as he locked the garage for the night. Because sometimes people arrive carrying problems they cannot solve alone. Lily tilted her head thoughtfully. Do they ever tell everyone you fixed them? Ethan looked toward the fading orange sky where the last rays of sunlight rested across the fields. His answer came with the same gentle certainty that guided every choice he made. The engine does not care whose name receives the credit, sweetheart. It only cares whether someone took the time to make it right. Lily nodded, quietly storing those words in her heart, never realizing they would one day explain far more than the machines surrounding them. Victoria finally lifted the coffee cup, but the warmth in her hands only deepened the chill settling inside her heart. She looked around the garage with new eyes, noticing details she had ignored for an entire decade. Every shelf was organized with quiet precision. Every tool rested exactly where it belonged. Every engine carried a handwritten tag bearing dates, temperatures, mileage estimates, operating conditions, and careful observations recorded in neat blue ink. This was never the workshop of a man who merely repaired broken machines. It was the laboratory of someone who understood how every moving part depended on every other. Ethan walked toward one of the storage shelves and gently removed a thick black notebook. The cover showed faded fingerprints and worn corners from years of daily use. He opened it without ceremony and placed it on the table between them. Victoria leaned forward. Every page contained sketches, measurements, airflow calculations, notes about fuel delivery, vibration patterns, and cooling performance. Some pages included alternative designs drawn in remarkable detail. Others explained why a component would eventually fail long before any visible damage appeared. Ethan quietly turned another page. Then another. Finally, Victoria whispered, "These are engineering redesigns." Ethan nodded. Most of the engines did not need major repairs. They needed someone to understand why they kept failing. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "You changed the designs?" Ethan answered with the same calm voice he used when explaining simple repairs to customers. "Only when I believed it would make the engine more reliable. If I could solve the problem without replacing expensive parts, I usually did." Victoria slowly shook her head. "Why did you never send us a consulting proposal? Why did you never ask for meetings with my engineers?" Ethan smiled gently. "Because nobody asked." The answer landed heavier than any accusation ever could. Outside, a breeze carried dry autumn leaves across the gravel parking lot, producing a soft rustling sound that filled the silence between them. Victoria remembered dozens of board meetings where senior engineers confidently presented improved reliability charts. She remembered applauding innovation awards, approving bonuses, and congratulating research teams whose presentations closely matched the very improvements now resting inside Ethan's notebooks. None of them had ever mentioned his name. Perhaps they had never known where the solutions truly began. Perhaps they had simply accepted the results once the repaired engines arrived. Ethan never investigated. Recognition had never been the reason he opened his garage before sunrise every morning. He closed the notebook and carefully returned it to the shelf. "An engine teaches patience," he said quietly. "If you force one part to carry more than it should, eventually everything else begins to suffer." Companies are not much different. Victoria felt those words settle deeply within her. For years she had believed leadership meant moving faster than everyone else. Ethan believed leadership meant making sure every unseen piece could continue carrying its share of the load. Looking around the humble garage once more, she realized the greatest engineer her company had ever depended upon had never worked inside a glass office, never attended shareholder meetings, and never appeared on a single organizational chart. He had simply remained here, quietly protecting a company that barely knew he existed. Victoria leaned back in the old wooden chair as memories she had once celebrated now returned carrying an entirely different meaning. She remembered the year Hayes Power Systems was featured on the cover of a national business magazine after reporting record growth. Reporters called her a visionary. Investors praised the company's engineering culture. Industry leaders invited her to conferences where she confidently described innovation, efficiency, and bold leadership. Every round of applause had felt earned. Every headline had seemed like proof that relentless ambition always produced extraordinary results. Yet sitting inside Ethan's quiet garage, she realized success had often arrived inside battered wooden shipping crates before it ever appeared in polished presentations. Ethan opened another cabinet, and carefully placed several worn folders across the table. Inside each folder rested copies of the handwritten inspection sheets he had kept for his own records whenever he repaired another engine. Every page was dated. Every recommendation matched the gradual improvements that had later become standard features across the company's newest products. Victoria recognized the timeline immediately. Better cooling channels, stronger bearing support, improved airflow around critical components, reduced vibration under heavy loads. They were all there, recorded months before her engineering division had proudly announced those same breakthroughs. She slowly closed one folder and looked at Ethan with quiet disbelief. "You never stopped documenting everything." Ethan nodded. "Machines remember every decision you make. I believe people should be able to do the same." His words carried no bitterness, only quiet conviction. Victoria thought about all the promotion ceremonies she had attended over the years. Engineers had received raises. Executives had accepted bonuses. Entire departments had celebrated achievements supported by charts showing dramatic improvements in reliability. No one had questioned why those improvements always appeared shortly after another shipment returned from this little garage. Everyone had simply accepted the results because success rarely encourages difficult questions. Ethan had accepted something else entirely. Every payment arrived exactly as promised, and every check helped him continue raising Lily with dignity. He replaced old equipment only when absolutely necessary. He repaired his own tools instead of buying new ones. He never borrowed beyond what he could repay. He built a quiet life measured not by wealth, but by trust. Customers kept returning because they knew he would never recommend work that was unnecessary and never charge for repairs that honesty could avoid. Lily eventually stepped back into the garage carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies she had prepared the night before. She placed them on the table with a warm smile. Victoria thanked her softly before noticing framed photographs hanging near the office door. One showed Lily holding a small fishing rod beside Ethan at a nearby lake. Another captured her high school science fair, where she proudly displayed a model engine. There were no photographs of expensive vacations or luxury homes. There were only moments shared together, carefully preserved. Across the years, Victoria suddenly understood something that no financial report had ever measured. While she had spent 10 years building a corporation that demanded every waking hour, Ethan had quietly built a daughter who trusted the world because she had first learned to trust her father. In that moment, the silence inside the garage felt richer than every celebration that had ever echoed through the executive offices she once believed defined success. Victoria rested both hands on the edge of the old workbench as another memory surfaced with painful clarity. 3 years earlier, during the company's most successful quarter, the executive board had gathered inside a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline. Revenue had reached record levels. Investors were celebrating. Reporters were requesting interviews. One senior executive had stood proudly before a giant screen displaying impressive charts and announced that the engineering division had finally become completely self-sufficient. The room erupted in applause. Victoria remembered smiling with quiet satisfaction before making the decision that now echoed louder than every celebration combined. She had approved a recommendation stating that future prototype development would remain entirely in-house. Outside consultants would no longer be necessary. Independent repair evaluations would be discontinued. Every department agreed. It sounded efficient. It sounded modern. It sounded like progress. A week later, the final transport truck arrived at Ethan's garage carrying one last prototype engine. Ethan welcomed the familiar driver with the same warm handshake he had offered for years. He noticed the shipment paperwork looked different. There were no future delivery schedules attached. No handwritten note requesting another rush inspection. The driver shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Corporate says this is the last one. They built a new research center. Everything is staying there from now on." Ethan simply nodded. "I hope it serves them well." The driver hesitated. "You are taking this better than I expected." Ethan smiled as he secured the engine onto its stand. Every customer has the right to choose their own path. There was no resentment in his voice. No complaint. Only quiet acceptance. After the truck disappeared down the highway, Lily stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She had just finished her first semester studying mechanical engineering at the local college, inspired by the countless afternoons spent watching her father solve problems that textbooks rarely explained. She noticed the empty driveway and asked, "Are they coming back next month?" Ethan looked toward the road for a brief moment before gently shaking his head. "I do not think so." Lily frowned. "Does that bother you?" Ethan wiped a clean cloth across the polished engine block before answering. "People sometimes believe they no longer need the hands that help them climb. That does not erase the value of the climb." Together they completed the final inspection exactly as they had done hundreds of times before. Ethan added another handwritten report filled with observations and recommendations. He sealed the envelope even though he quietly suspected no one would ever read it. He believed that doing careful work remained worthwhile even when appreciation never arrived. Months passed. The garage welcomed old neighbors, farmers, delivery drivers, and families preparing for long summer vacations. Life continued with its familiar rhythm. Meanwhile, far away inside the impressive glass headquarters, small warning signs began appearing inside testing reports. Minor temperature increases were dismissed as acceptable. Unusual vibration patterns were labeled insignificant. Components were down slightly faster than expected, but deadlines mattered more than questions. Every issue seemed too small to delay production. Yet somewhere beneath polished presentations and confident speeches, tiny imperfections quietly began collecting, just as Ethan had always warned in notebooks that nobody had taken the time to read. He had never predicted failure with anger. He had only understood that when little problems are ignored long enough, they eventually stop asking for attention and begin demanding consequences. The first signs appeared so quietly that almost everyone dismissed them. A customer reported that one industrial engine required more maintenance than expected after only a few hundred operating hours. Another client mentioned inconsistent performance during extended testing. A regional distributor requested clarification about unusual were found inside several production units. Each report reached headquarters through different departments, and each one received a reasonable explanation. The engineering division described them as isolated incidents. Quality control recommended routine adjustments. The legal department saw no immediate concern. On paper, every answer sounded convincing. In reality, every answer ignored the same question Ethan had spent years asking before he ever picked up a wrench. Why did the problem exist in the first place? Victoria remembered sitting through meeting after meeting while executives confidently presented colorful charts proving that everything remained under control. She wanted to believe them because success had become familiar. Growth had become expected. Confidence had become part of the company's identity. No one wanted to slow production. No one wanted to delay another product launch. No one wanted to admit that small imperfections might be pointing toward a much larger truth. Then the customer calls began arriving faster. Service departments struggled to keep pace. Replacement orders increased. Manufacturing schedules slipped behind. The financial team quietly adjusted quarterly forecasts for the first time in years. Investors noticed. Questions grew sharper during earnings calls. Reporters began asking why warranty expenses had suddenly increased. The answers sounded polished, but confidence no longer carried the same weight. One rainy evening, long after most employees had gone home, Victoria walked alone through the nearly empty engineering floor. The bright offices that once buzzed with optimism now felt strangely quiet. Computer screens glowed in dark cubicles while unfinished reports covered conference tables. She paused beside a prototype engine sitting under white inspection lights. Something about it felt familiar, although she could not explain why. She gently rested her hand on the metal housing and suddenly remembered Ethan doing exactly the same thing years earlier before every inspection. He never rushed to replace parts. He always stood silently for a moment first, listening, observing, respecting the machine before offering a solution. At the time, she had considered it an old mechanic's habit. Now she wondered if it had been wisdom. Weeks later, the board called an emergency meeting. Revenue projections dropped again. Several major contracts were placed on hold while customers requested additional testing before accepting future deliveries. Analysts lowered their ratings. The company's stock price began slipping day after day. Nobody inside the room spoke with the confidence they once carried so effortlessly. Victoria listened as department heads blamed supply chains, changing market conditions, rising costs, and economic uncertainty. Yet beneath every explanation, she heard an uncomfortable silence that no presentation could hide. They had spent years searching for someone to blame while forgetting the one person who had quietly prevented these very problems from reaching them. Sitting inside Ethan's garage now, she closed her eyes as the full weight of that realization finally settled over her. The company had not collapsed in a single day. It had slowly drifted away from humility, one overlooked lesson at a time, until the quiet voice they no longer heard was the very one they needed most. The garage grew quiet once more as the afternoon sun settled lower across the valley. Long rays of golden light stretched through the open bay door, casting gentle shadows over rows of carefully labeled shelves that Victoria had never truly noticed before. Ethan stood and walked toward a narrow hallway at the back of the building. After a brief pause, he opened a plain wooden door she had always assumed led to storage. "There is something you should see," he said softly. Victoria followed him inside. The room was larger than she expected. Floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounded every wall, each one holding neatly organized binders, boxes, and engine components preserved with remarkable care. Every binder carried a date. Every box listed a project number. Every shelf represented another year of quiet dedication. Ethan reached for one thick binder marked with the very first year they had worked together. Inside were photographs of every engine before and after repair, detailed measurements, redesigned sketches, handwritten calculations, fuel efficiency estimates, and notes predicting future where long before any failure would become visible. Victoria slowly turned another page. Then another. Every improvement her company had celebrated seemed to exist here months, sometimes even a full year, before appearing inside corporate presentations. Her breathing became slower as realization replaced disbelief. She opened another binder from several years later. The pattern repeated itself. Another redesign. Another solved problem. Another recommendation that had somehow become standard practice inside Hayes Power Systems without anyone ever connecting it to the quiet mechanic working in this forgotten garage. Ethan watched her silently. He had no desire to prove anyone wrong. He simply believed truth deserved a place where it could survive the passing of time. Victoria finally stopped turning pages. Tears gathered in her eyes as she whispered, "This room tells the entire story of my company." Ethan gently shook his head. "It tells the story of the engines. Companies belong to many people." His answer carried the same humility that had defined every choice he had made for the last decade. At that moment, Lily stepped into the room, carrying a small cardboard box. "Dad, I found these while cleaning the office closet." Ethan smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart." He opened the box and revealed dozens of unopened envelopes bearing the Hayes Power Systems logo. Victoria recognized them immediately. They were every inspection report Ethan had mailed after each repair, returned unopened whenever company departments changed addresses or personnel. Some envelopes still carried forwarding labels. Others had never even been unsealed. Ethan had quietly filed every returned report instead of throwing them away. Victoria picked up one envelope with trembling hands and carefully opened it. Inside, Ethan had predicted a cooling system, weakness that later cost the company millions of dollars to correct. Another report warned about long-term bearing stress nearly 5 years before the issue became widespread. Every answer had existed. Every warning had been written. Every opportunity to prevent the collapse had quietly arrived through the mailbox of a company too busy celebrating success to listen. Victoria slowly lowered the papers onto the table. For the first time in her career, she understood that the greatest loss was not the money, the buildings, or the reputation. The greatest loss had been overlooking the quiet wisdom of a man who had never once asked to be important, yet had spent 10 faithful years protecting people who never realized how deeply they depended upon him. Victoria carefully returned the final notebook to its place and stood in silence for a long moment. The room no longer felt like a storage space. It felt like a living record of faithfulness, built one careful page at a time by a man who had never expected applause. She turned toward Ethan with tears quietly resting in her eyes. "I came here hoping you could save my company," she said. "Now I realize I should have come years ago to thank the man who helped build it." Ethan folded his hands gently in front of him. "Companies can be rebuilt," he replied. "Trust takes longer. But both begin the same way. Someone has to choose honesty first." Victoria lowered her head. For the first time in many years, she was not thinking about market value or investor confidence. She was thinking about the thousands of people whose paychecks depended on the company finding a future. Factory workers, truck drivers, office assistants, families who had never met her but trusted her decisions every single day. "Will you help us?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the open doorway where Lily stood listening with calm understanding. She smiled softly and stepped closer. "Dad," she said, "you always told me that fixing something is not about proving who was right. It is about making sure it can keep serving the people who depend on it." Ethan smiled with quiet pride. "I remember saying that." Lily nodded. "Those families did not make the mistake." Ethan remained silent for a few moments. The evening breeze drifted through the garage, carrying the scent of fresh pine and distant fields. The old wind chime near the office door rang gently, just as it had on countless ordinary afternoons. Finally, he turned back toward Victoria. "If we do this, we do it differently. No hidden work. No forgotten voices. Every engineer learns why every change matters. Every technician is encouraged to ask questions. Every improvement is documented with the name of the person who discovered it. Respect has to become part of the design, not just the company handbook." Victoria nodded before he had even finished speaking. "You have my word." Several months later, the first rebuilding meeting took place not inside a towering corporate office, but around the same worn wooden table inside Ethan's garage. Engineers sat beside mechanics. Executives listened to technicians. Young apprentices asked questions without fear of embarrassment. Every suggestion was written down. Every contribution received acknowledgement. Slowly, confidence returned, not because someone promised quick success, but because people finally began listening to one another. As the seasons changed once again, the little garage remained much the same. The coffee still filled the morning air. The radio still played old country songs. Ethan still opened the doors before sunrise, and Lily, now preparing to begin her engineering career, still smiled whenever she walked through them. One evening, as they closed the garage together, Victoria paused beside the faded wooden sign above the entrance. She no longer saw an ordinary repair shop. She saw the place where humility had quietly protected greatness for 10 faithful years. The world often celebrates the loudest voices, the tallest buildings, and the biggest victories. Yet sometimes the strongest foundation is built by someone whose name never appears on the front page. Because in the end, engines may run on precision, companies may run on strategy, but lives are sustained by character, quiet dignity, and the simple courage to keep doing what is right even when no one is watching. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.